All right, friends, this will be a fantastic conversation. I mean, one of the things I love to do, and that I get to do, is have deep conversations publicly. I mean, that's why we do the podcast. And today is no exception. I have Myron Penner on the podcast. You're a philosophy of religion professor. You do all kinds of stuff. I've had you on the podcast before. We talked about modern and postmodern thinking. It was amazing. So it's great to have you back, and thanks for making time. I really appreciate it.
Hey, I really appreciate the opportunity. Appreciate just all the good work you and your team do, and just happy to be part of the conversation.
Well, it's interesting because a few months ago you reached out to me and was like, "Hey, man, I read this book by this guy named Joe Rigney called Sin of Empathy," and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I know about that book," because obviously, as someone who tracks Christian nationalism, we've been noticing this new talking point of like toxic empathy or empathy being sinful or the potential for it to be sinful, and that's been used by a lot of right-wing people to be like, this is why we should be against, immigration, and why we should be in favor of these ICE raids, because look what happens when we have toxic empathy. These bad outcomes happen. And it's been really interesting seeing how they've kind of created a new talking point. But you also have come on because we're going to kind of unpack that side of it and also talk about maybe some other more progressive takes that would also maybe say on the surface we should keep our empathy in check, but not for the outcomes that Christian nationalists want. So I'm really excited to have this conversation because empathy is like it's the topic to talk about right now, and I'm looking forward to it.
I mean, it's kind of like if you could imagine a fundamentalist evangelical war room trying to come up with what is one talking point that's going to upset progressives the most, it would be like, well, let's take on empathy and let's call it a sin. And I think part of the reason that hit so hard with progressives is I think for a lot of people, their own personal story is one of coming to find empathy for people who have been marginalized by the church. And it really is transformative for people to come to realize that, people that they have othered and put outside of just a common Christian community have actually felt pain. And that has caused people to feel pain themselves in a way that has led to their own kind of personal and theological transformation. Right. And so for people like that, empathy has been part of the solution, not part of the problem. And it's led to deeper faith, deeper theological commitments, deeper relationships of all sorts. And so for people who've had that experience with empathy, to call it a sin is just one of the most egregious kind of things that can be there.
Yeah, I totally agree. I actually just wrote about this on, I have a personal Substack at Tim Whitaker Speaks for folks who might want to check it out. But I just wrote about, my experience in church and wrestling with the reality that I had a pretty good church experience overall, and how also my white evangelical tradition gave me a real sense of empathy for my fellow neighbor. I mean, the idea of love your neighbor as yourself is part of the Christian tradition. So, I would agree. Like, for me, empathy is, I would argue, key to being Christ-like. I mean, you could even make the argument that the incarnation is a big act of empathy, right? God taking on the form of a human to empathize and feel what it's like to be in our shoes as human beings, right? So yes, I would totally agree with you. And when I saw this book by Joe Rigney, which, by the way, for folks who don't know, Joe Rigney, he is a quote-unquote professor, term used lightly at New St. Andrews College. That's a college that's in like the Doug Wilson dominionist kind of world. So that's where this is coming from. So when he wrote this book, I saw the title, I went, oh my gosh, of course they're going to do this, right? Of course they're going to make this argument. And just to kind of lay out my thesis, and I'll hand it over to you, and you can give us some definitions and stuff. I think the reason why they're doing this is because it's obvious that when you watch on your phone either bombs dropping on people's heads in Gaza, or I'm not sure if you saw the video of the girl walking through flames in Gaza recently, or you see ICE agents ripping literal infants out of their mother's arms because national security, you naturally empathize and say, oh my God, I can't believe I'm watching this, because I would not want to be in that person's shoes. Like, you feel for them, especially as a parent, right? And so it's not some detached feeling. It's like a visceral, emotional sense of pain that really starts to take hold. deeply embedded. I mean, I've wept. I know a lot of us feel this sense of powerlessness seeing these images and not being able to do anything about it, right? I mean, it's horrible. And I think empathy is because, and empathy is what leads to those outcomes as we advocate for a more just society. And I think that a lot of the Christian nationalist world realizes that a lot of the images that they are in support of do look terrible and are tragic and are painful. And so they have to create a new theology or add on to their existing theology of why now even empathy, why even showing empathy for your fellow man can be sinful or can be toxic as it relates to pretty much reinforcing right-wing talking points and denigrating any left-wing perspective, politically speaking, right? So that's kind of my general thesis. But you actually read the book, so I would kind of love your thoughts on it as you read it.
Yeah, well, I think the pushback against empathy is really kind of a defensive maneuver. And just a little anecdote. So I teach at a private Christian university, and like a lot of Christian spaces that have their roots kind of in kind of broad evangelicalism, how they treat LGBTQ plus people is a very kind of contentious point in lots of constituencies. About 10 years ago, there was a student group that started at my university, built of queer students and alumni, called One TWU. It was patterned after a lot of similar kinds of groups at other Christian spaces. And they began having these storytelling events, just a once a year, event on campus where queer students, queer alums could kind of tell their own story, and just to provide a space for people to hear what it's like to be queer in a Christian university. And they that got shut down eventually after several years of this happening on campus. By and large, it being well received, that got shut down because, quote unquote, one very senior leader at the time said, look, people hear these stories and it just swamps their good theology. Right. It leads them to change to change from kind of orthodox theology to something different. And so we shouldn't even allow space for people to tell these stories.
Wow.
And so, if empathy is the gateway to causing you to kind of reflect on theology, and if you have this kind of this particular view that theology never changes, it's once and for all delivered to the saints, and faithfulness means believing these right things. Any deviation from that, any push to cause you to maybe call that into question is going to be seen as sinful.
100%. So break it down for me. I mean, just give me the overview of Rigney's point first, and we can kind of break down, where you want to get to. What is his overall point? Is it that empathy as a whole is sinful, or just certain types? Like, what is he arguing for here?
Yeah, so the main kind of thesis is that, first of all, when we're talking about empathy, we're really talking about that visceral, emotional sharing of space between people who are suffering. And so you see someone overwhelmed with sadness, and you start to feel sad, not only for them, but also with them. You see people who are experiencing traumatic kinds of circumstances of different sorts, and you start to feel that trauma in your own body, right? In ways that might alter your beliefs, might alter your actions, might motivate you to behave in certain ways. And to try and be fair, he's not saying that it is always or necessarily bad to have that kind of emotional response. But what he's advocating for, or what he's arguing against, is what he calls untethered empathy. And of course, you can imagine where those tethers go, right? And so he would say that your emotional response to circumstances needs to be anchored to, tethered to, framed within, a very reformed evangelical framework for who God is, what God wants, and what the good life amounts to, right? And so he's not saying that caring for someone is bad, but the question he wants to ask is, well, what does it mean to actually care for someone if you think that these biblical truths are true? How do emotions get in the way of living faithfully? It's kind of is how he would argue.
Okay, and what's your response to that? I'm curious.
Well, so to me, I became interested in kind of empathy from a social scientific point about 8 or 9 years ago. There's a very well-known psychologist, Paul Bloom, who has done lots of really interesting work studying kind of developmental psychology, how children's minds work, how lots of kind of core religious concepts seem to be quite naturally occurring at different developmental stages, and very, very well-regarded a psychologist who's made lots of interesting contributions. And he came out in 2016 with this very provocative book title called Against Empathy. And the subtitle is The Case for Rational Compassion. And Bloom does point out, I mean, he's not a religious person. He's not, saying that empathy is a sin. He doesn't use those kind of moral categories.
Right.
But what he does, though, is he points out that in a lot of cases, a paradigm example of his is, to whom should you give money? Right. And you see an ad for some kind of charity, and you feel a certain way, and it causes you to give some money. Right. You have an empathetic response. It leads to an action and an outcome. He kind of takes a step back and says, well, is that really the most effective use of your resources, right? Does empathy help you, or does it lead you astray in that case? Because it might actually be more effective if you were less empathetic, had compassion, wanted to, had concern for people, but wanted to think through, okay, how, what are my resources? What's going to be the most effective result? What's going to bring the best result for the largest amount of people? And so he points out, and Rigney kind of quotes Bloom's work, and he says, this is Bloom now, that sometimes empathy as an emotion can get in the way. And so, what just for me as a philosopher and someone who interacts with psychologists and scientists on a regular basis, and also as a Christian, for me the larger question is, well, what are emotions, and how, on the one hand, they seem so deeply fundamental to human being and our sense of shared humanity that we feel things together, and what are the instances where that emotional response can lead to good outcomes, when are sometimes cases that it can actually lead to bad outcomes. And the thing is, I mean, fundamentalist, anti-woke Christian nationalists, they recruit empathy too, right? Because empathy can be very selective. You just need to have empathy for that person whose job was taken away because of immigration, right? You need to have empathy for X, Y, and Z, and empathy can be recruited to really favor people for whom you share lots of other identity markers, right? So it gets a little bit there's not a quick and straight line in every case.
No, that's helpful. I mean, I think what bugs me about books like Ali Sucky's book, Toxic Empathy, or Joe's book, is that, like a lot of anything, there maybe is a hint of truth in the premise, right? For example, I'm not sure if you remember the infamous case of Brock Turner. He was a Stanford University swimmer. He sexually assaulted an unconscious woman, and the judge gave him like 6 months, and even kind of hinted at, like, I don't want to destroy this man's life. That's a good example of toxic empathy, in my opinion, right? Like, okay, that does exist, right? That the judge felt for this person in a certain way that led to a really unjust outcome. So I don't disagree with the premise that any emotion, including empathy, can be unhealthy and can lead to bad outcomes. What drives me crazy is how they then argue that what's currently happening with ICE raids nationally is a good thing. And what they do is this, right? This is the bait and switch that Ali Sucky does all the time. They always pull up anecdotal stories. Like they pull up the story of Laken Riley, right? Which is, of course, a terrible story of an undocumented immigrant who did commit a heinous crime towards a person, right? That is an actual fact. And then what they'll do is they'll say, look, because we're a nation of open borders, because of empathy, that toxic empathy led to this outcome. When in reality, that's not true. And number two, statistically, undocumented immigrants are half as likely to commit crimes as native-born counterparts. So if there's a reason why Ali will never talk about the problem of white men and their violence, right? Or why it's usually white men who are committing mass shootings. There's no argument for toxic empathy there. It's usually always aimed at the outgroup of of who she's trying to demonize, right? And it's really effective because it's a real story grounded in reality that is then used to cast a shadow on an entire people group. And it's incredibly unfair, and also it oversimplifies a very complicated situation, especially with our immigration courts and how often laws change, and it's a real mess, right? And so that's what drives me crazy.
And there's lots of very robust psychology and psychological science that confirms exactly the kind of thing that you were just saying, where we have certain types of prejudices or stereotypes, a lot of them culturally shaped and tuned, and we see one instance that confirms the stereotypes that we have, and we just place so much evidential weight on that as just a marker of obvious truth, ignoring, like you said, just the actual statistical data is that one instance actually reflective of larger group dynamics, right? And so a common example, I just think often of people who have different racial stereotypes about drivers, right?
Yes.
And if you see one person who conforms to your expected outcome for a certain racial group, that just verifies to you everything that you've held before. The problem is you've ignored all the other people that have been perfectly good drivers of those similar groups. It's just that one bit of evidence that confirms to your stereotypes, right? And so that is a human thing. I think so. What one of the critiques I would have about Rigney's book is that he has a very particular theological framework that he thinks is the bounds of how empathy should operate.
Right.
When he says tethered empathy, he's got a very particular view about what those tethers should look like, his views about what the Bible are, about how that feeds into a whole kind of theological story. And I think, maybe common ground could be to say, look, we can agree that it's, some cases empathy can be toxic, some cases, and it needs to be tethered to larger conversations. But what are those tethers, and why is kind of the more conservative, reformed evangelical way of describing those tethers? Why are those the right ones? And can we have a conversation about what Christian, healthy and appropriate Christian empathy could look like if we just change the parameters in which it would operate? And I think that's, that if a person were willing to have that kind of conversation, it might turn the temperature down on some of the empathy wars.
Well, in my experience, you're the Joe Rigneys of the world, your Ali Suckers of the world. I call them white evangelical fundamentalists, and essentially what they're doing is they're coming from this, they're coming from a perspective that says, look, we have an understanding of absolute moral truth that the majority of people do not have. And it is found not only in the Bible, but in how we interpret it. Now, they'll never say how they interpret it. They just use terms like, this is a biblical worldview. This is what the Bible clearly teaches, right? They don't have the ability or the integrity to say, well, no, we are interpreting it through a specific framework, and we're highlighting some verses over others, etc., right? So they start with this idea of God is the great moral truth giver. This God can be known. God can be personal. God has revealed themselves in the English Protestant Bible in a very unique way that is infallible and inerrant. How we read the Bible is biblical. Therefore, we have truth, and people outside of this do not, right? And so that all those steps, there's a whole universe to unpack along the way, right? But it's hard to do that on Twitter. It's hard to do that on Threads, right? It's hard to do that in even a half-hour conversation on a podcast because there are so many assumptions baked into all of those statements that if you don't agree with, you have to unpack with that person, right? And the result is what we're seeing now. Again, I go back to right now, immigration is such a big deal because the Trump administration from the beginning, even before he got reelected, said what they're going to do, and it was backed by this right-wing evangelical movement that is essentially now saying, Matt Walsh, Charlie Kirk, and Jack Posobiec all said we have to ban and get rid of all the third worlders in the country, and we all know what that's code for. It's code for white supremacy. We're talking about brown-skinned people ultimately, right? But they mask this in some kind of biblical narrative or some kind of this is toxic empathy, and the result itself is incredibly toxic.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the story that incremental kind of story that you just put together is also tied up in this idea of American exceptionalism, and that America
Mm,
as a
yeah.
Christian nation works best when we can get rid of like the woke progressive liberal kind of things that are really eating at the culture. So I mean, you. So here's a. Not to quote too much, but I got this great quotation from Rigney's book. Great in one sense. God designed us so that our minds would rule and govern our passions. God over mind, mind over passions, and virtue requires us to act faithfully in those ways, right? So this idea that we're starting with an unfiltered, unmediated, clear and accurate picture of who God is and what God wants,
Right.
and how that then influences our mind, how we should think about things, our theological kind of framework, and that's what we need to do to evaluate any kind of emotional or what he would say is the passions, right? And so, yeah,
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, you're a philosopher, you do social science work, like you have a lot of different disciplines under your belt. One of the things I can't get around is the reality that we're like, okay, so what you just said, right? Like about God and how, all that stuff. Ultimately, though, we're all trying to negotiate what we think God is. Like there
yeah,
is
yeah,
no,
yeah,
in a way, there really is no God in the sense of like we can go and verify or hear the voice of God collectively and say, look,
yeah,
God has spoken, right? We have to make these assumptions that God spoke in the Bible or God spoke here. But again, I feel like you end up in this circular reasoning because the Bible
hmm
was written by humans. You have
yeah,
to assign a value of divine inspiration to it to them, rationalize that this is what God wrote down, even though a lot of different authors over hundreds of years with many different editors and
yeah,
manuscripts
yeah,
and compilations put together the Bible. So that's where I like, as I kind of renegotiated my faith, I kind of realized that like that basis of fundamentalism that I was given of like this Bible is God's perfect and inerrant word to you, it just
yeah.
falls apart because humans wrote it, not God, ultimately.
Yeah, I think but depending on whom you're having a conversation with, you're probably not going to want to lead with that because
Right,
that's going to
right.
be core, But it did strike me a couple of years ago that I can't think of any problem that's going to be solved by someone starting by saying, well, look, I've got this magic book, right? And in this magic book, this is what the answer is going to be. And I think that a uh, a more nuanced view of the Bible is just so central to how people process their faith that it's hard for them even to think that. I think one possible point of contact, and I think this is where, I mean, we are getting like more and more information about just some of the downstream effects of this, you know, toxic theological framing, on women who deal with the effects of purity culture, of course,
Yep.
for LGBTQ people. As we get so like you think about queer couples in loving consensual relationships and how you just have a lot of the virtues expressed in like what more could a person want in loving relationships of mutual care and affection, right? So I think the like pointing out the consequences that we see of certain kinds of theological assumptions about what the Bible is and what it teaches, that is, I think, harder to just brush aside, and yeah,
Why?
I think those kinds of considerations, I think,
Mm.
might have the impact to say, well, maybe those tethers that I was trying to tether emotion to actually have some they could be in some cases harmful constraints and not helpful.
The other day, the SBC, which is the nation's largest
Yeah, yeah,
conglomerate
yeah,
of churches, right? They passed a resolution calling to overturn a Obergefell, which is the right for gay
yeah,
people to get married, right? I mean, this
yeah,
is like wild to me because this is a
yeah,
denomination of churches or a conglomerate of churches, and they're so distraught by the fact that other people have the right to marry who they want, that they want to
Yeah.
try and overturn it. Where do you think this comes from ultimately? Because I mean, and I gotta be honest with you, Myron, like even when I was a more conservative evangelical, I understood that not everyone thought like me, and that in a free country, at least that's what I thought this place was, people have the right to behave in ways that I wouldn't agree with, including being able to marry who they want to get the same legal rights. Like that wasn't a crazy thought. But for some reason, the Christian nationalist movement that we're seeing today feels like even that reality is so problematic that they have to actually try to overturn a Supreme Court decision. Where do you think that comes from, as in the terms of like sociology or philosophy, maybe related to toxic empathy? Like how do you assess that kind of statement?
It's, I mean, there's lots of people who have written and studied about factors that drive the increasing polarization that we see, but I think the the large kind of point is just that there is just an intolerance for people who have different views, and I think it's connected to power and the way in which resources get distributed and allocated. And so if you think that the clear moral teaching is this particular view about marriage, and the law of the land violates that, and if you think that your motivation as a citizen, as an American, and as a Christian is to make sure that the laws of the land reflect what you think are biblical truths, then everything is fair game, right? And it's just that driving kind of impetus to say that I have access to certain truths, and there's just no compromise, right? And these, it's all tied to this idea too of this is what it means to be a virtuous believer. 100 completely sold out, no compromise, called to great things,
Yes,
called to
yes.
sacrifice, head out. Our country's a mission field. We're at war. The stakes are high. And we did it with with this political view. We can just keep on going.
So let's get back
And
to.
I mean,
Oh, yeah.
There's there's a part of that is it those same kinds of emotions, right? The sense of being connected to a larger purpose, a larger
Right.
reality,
Right.
that can be part of religion's good aspects and good aspects of Christianity, where you have common cause to try and make the world a better place, and you can see yourself in that story. I mean, like that by itself isn't wrong, but
Agreed.
when the consequences are to really coerce your theology into a wider framework that has these negative effects for people, that's where it just goes astray.
100%. So let's get back to what was the name of the other person who wrote the book about empathy? Who was it?
Paul Bloom. Yeah.
Okay, and you said he's like a progressive psychologist. Is that correct?
I mean, yeah. So he, I mean, he's had a long and distinguished career. Paul Bloom was at Yale. I believe he's at University of Toronto now, and he, has made, lots of, seminal contributions to psychology. He, studies religion in different ways, and is of this idea that, when it comes to certain kind of moral attitudes and religious kind of concepts, they have a very natural kind of fit with who we are. And he studies morality and did this kind of work on empathy to kind of point out some different ways that empathy can sometimes lead to bad outcomes. He's the one who says that we ought to advocate for rational compassion. It's good to be concerned for people, but if we want to think, what's going to be the best result to provide the most benefit for people. Yeah, sometimes empathy can tell us to do one thing when actually rational reflection would maybe have us do something else. Right.
And,
So
break this down for me. Like, I'm really kind of curious about this, because I mean, like, I think I understand like what's going on, but like, how do you as someone who read his stuff and kind of sees this along with the toxic empathy that we're trying to fight against, like, how do you kind of thread that needle?
Well, I think what I think the point that Bloom, the main takeaway of Bloom's research for me and I mean, you find this a little bit in Rigney. It just gets, layered through all these Reformed evangelical assumptions that are
Yeah.
deeply problematic. But I think the kernel of truth there is to say, when I feel something so strongly, right, and it compels me to act in a certain way, uh, do I have the capacity to maybe take a step back and just try and anchor that emotional response in a larger context?
Mm.
Why am I feeling this way? What are the values that are in? What are the concepts and the cultural kind of framing that is making me feel this certain way? And what are the impacts of on people if I follow this kind of path, right?
Yes.
And I think that's true of empathy. It's true of all these other kinds of primary emotional responses like anger, fear, sometimes disgust.
Yes.
When people are just have these strong, when you have this strong kind of revulsion, right? And that might lead to automatic behavior of a certain kind. Uh, uh, I think it's for me, the takeaway is to try and cultivate a practice of just pausing and trying to reflect and say, where is this feeling coming from? Why am I feeling this certain way? What would be the impacts on other people if I followed this feeling to where it seems to be leading me, right? And I think when it comes to empathy, it's it's I think it's okay to ask that same question, right? And not to assume either from the left or the right that A, having empathy is automatically good or bad, or B, is going to automatically lead to good or bad outcomes, right? I think when it comes to, uh, you know, uh, using empathy as a way to favor your own in group, that seems problematic.
Hmm.
Using empathy to um, uh, to just you know fuel all of your actions in a particular way is going to be exhausting and hard to maintain as well.
So what do you think? I mean, what is that path forward then, right? Because obviously empathy is a normal human emotion,
Yeah.
like
Hmm.
anything, right? I mean, maybe an easier one to pick on first is anger, right? Anger
Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
powerful emotion, and when
Yeah.
used right can lead to really just outcomes, right? And when used
Yeah.
wrong can really hurt people, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that could be for any emotion. And when it comes to empathy, the idea of being able to relate to someone else and kind of put yourself in their shoes and feel how they feel, again, a very powerful emotion that can lead
Yeah.
to just outcomes. And
Yeah.
also at times, if misaligned or if aimed in the wrong way, can lead to Brock Turner getting a 6 month
Yeah.
slap on the wrist, right?
Yeah.
So this idea of is it rational compassion? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
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 I mean, what would be like what's a differentiator between the two then? Is rational compassion more of like, okay, I'm going to sit back and think through what would give me the best outcome despite maybe how strong I'm feeling one way or another in this moment? Is it more about putting like your emotions aside completely and just kind of going off the numbers and off of like the best possible outcome? Like break that down for me.
Yeah. So two things that I think are relevant at this point. So part of what's at issue here are different views about what emotions are.
Yeah.
And I think that this is kind of a contested point in psychology. And psychologists who study emotion, there's two kind of main views of thinking about what emotions are. And one kind of dominant view is this idea that we have basic human emotions. We've talked about some of them: empathy, anger, disgust, fear, love and positive affect, right? We feel a certain way. And on this one view, this is just part of what it means to be human. And there's some
Right.
suggestions that, they're cross-culturally recurrent. There's some research to suggest that, people recognize anger, happy, fear, regardless of cultural kind of tuning. And they might even be tied to certain kinds of bits of neural real estate. And one common view is that, there's a certain part of the brain, sometimes called reptile brain, that is really seen to be part of emotional responses, especially when it comes to fear, fight or flight kind of stuff. And so, uh, uh, if you think that that's what emotions are, and you think that empathy is a good emotion, it's going to be very hard to override that. A different way of thinking about emotions is not that they are kind of fixed universals, but rather that our brains construct emotional predictions about our responses to our environment because it's predicting what's going to happen in the future. And so, in this kind of idea, emotions are not cross-culturally recurrent in the same kind of way. They're highly tuned by your culture, right? And so I think for me, that's a bit more of a helpful way of thinking about the redeeming value of empathy, because we can tune our minds to have certain types of empathetic responses, and I think we can, as far as rational compassion goes, I think, if we have spaces where we can really try and articulate the assumptions that drive our values, try and hold those up and say, are these assumptions good? And are they life-giving to the greatest number of people, and start to infuse that kind of language in how we think about God, how we think about other Christians, how we think about people who are suffering, then that will shape our empathy in ways that will make it less likely that it's getting co-opted, right? And I think even just having this discussion about these emotional drivers that we have, uh, uh, are they like the problem with the Rigney approach, and it's that quote that I said,
Mm.
there's God,
Yeah.
mind, passions, right? And God's the
Right.
best, and then cold, reflective, rational thought, our theological framework, that's the lens by which we need to filter everything else. I mean, I think what we know so much from psychology is that that's kind of bullshit, right? This
Mm.
idea that it's through reflective reasoning that's devoid of any kinds of emotional motivations or anything like that.
Right.
That's not accurate. Even when we're using our minds, slowing down, articulating our theological beliefs and assumptions and justifying them. Do you think emotion's not doing anything when we do that? Do you think our preferences and our
Right.
motivations and our biases are not shaping that discussion?
Right.
Of course they are, right? And
Right.
so it turns out that we're attracted towards these theological framings that have their roots in the passions, if we want to use that kind of language. So
Yeah.
that's just kind of a so the project that Rigney is articulating is really called into question by good psychology. And so then I think let's put it all on the table. Let's talk about what we think reflectively is true, what we're feeling in certain points. Let's put it in conversation with each other and really try and have good conversations about what are the values that we should filter our emotions through and our experience. And I think in that way, what Bloom is saying is consistent with that, because he's just saying, pointing out, as you did earlier, that sometimes our emotional responses can lead us astray. Can we temper them and have a good discussion about what are the outcomes that we're looking for, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and this is where it's going to be hard to have that common ground with Christian nationalists, because the outcome that they're looking for is just going to be one that's radically different.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. It's funny. It's like when you hear, what's that Ben Shapiro quote? Facts don't care about your feelings. And I'm like, well, no, like feelings really impact like how we see the world,
Yeah,
and they
yeah,
even and how we interpret facts, right? I mean, that's
exactly.
a huge
Yeah,
part of it. And it is
yeah.
always funny when I hear Christian nationalists, well, the whatever, the left, they're just so emotional
Hmm.
and this, that. And it's like, have you guys seen yourselves? Like, have you seen how you behave? I mean,
Yeah,
again, it's not that people on the left are somehow more rational or more or
right.
less
Oh,
emotional,
right.
but we're humans. Like we're shaped. Emotions are a normal part of how humans function, and trying to pretend that like somehow one group is too emotional and you guys are somehow are above it is just kind of hilarious to me.
Yeah, and I mean, there are just so, like, the number and of spaces where people who disagree about things, or maybe share different assumptions,
Right.
the opportunities that they have to actually have meaningful relationship and dialogue is just shrinking, and they're just disappearing, right? And so
Yeah.
like, and research will also suggest that the way to generate some charity for people who hold different views than you is just to spend meaningful time in relationship with them, right? And to
Yeah.
humanize people in ways that could lead to better outcomes for everybody.
How do you read our current social predicament that we're in? I really do feel that we are living in two different realities. There are people that I
Yeah,
talk to and know who sincerely believe that the 2020 election was still stolen. They will
yeah,
tell me to my face it was rigged. Joe Biden should never have won. January
right.
6th was overwhelmingly peaceful. And I sit there and I'm like we have so much data that just contradicts that narrative, right? I even think
Right.
about just the way Trump talks and acts and how much he does not tell the truth. And by that, I mean verifiably, objectively so. Even over dumb stuff, like people that he knows or coaches in football that he knows. And I don't know how we as a society keep moving forward when it feels like we are living in two different realities and understand the world not just through like different frameworks, but through different universes and different
Hmm.
logics. Like the logic I see of Christian nationalism to me is inherently not logical, but to them
Right.
makes complete sense. And they think people like me are rational and out of our mind and denying basic biology, just things like
Hmm.
that. And I don't know
Hmm.
what to do with that because I don't feel like, we're debating, okay, we all want affordable healthcare, but how do we do it? One side says this, one side says that. We're debating almost like, well, the earth is flat. No, it's round.
Hmm.
No, it's flat. No, it's round. Like
Yeah.
I like things
Hmm.
that I never thought we'd be debating in America. As a,
Yeah.
again, as someone who studies this stuff on a social level, philosophical level, how do you read our current predicament?
I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. Is
Great.
kind of my prediction. Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, yeah. And I think there are different sorts of drivers for kind of broad cultural awakenings, and unfortunately, a lot of it is crisis. Like,
Mm,
God help the world if there is another COVID scale pandemic
yep.
in the next decade, right? Um, but you can imagine a situation where something like that would take hold, and with the decrease in institutions that are set up in democratic societies to safeguard those being eroded or undermined, uh, you know. Perhaps like wide scale population level devastation could actually could shake people to say, oh man, we need to have a different relationship to the facts here than what we've been told. I mean, that's kind of one thing that keeps me up at night sometimes, is just thinking about what would it take to actually set the conditions for a common kind of discourse, right? Because without that, I mean,
Yeah.
it's just power. Who's in power and who can dial up the rage machine most effectively to hold on to power. So I
Yeah.
think and but like movements, large grassroots kind of movements, small changes can have large impact over time. But
I was just talking to Trip Fuller a few weeks ago on the podcast. We were
yeah,
talking about
yeah,
algorithms and the digital
yeah,
media landscape. I think that is really a huge part of this too. Like there are just,
totally.
and again, I'm sure every generation says this, okay, but it does feel like there are so many unprecedented things happening all at one time, right? You
Yeah,
have this digital media explosion. You have these algorithms that are mediating our social relationships online. You have
yeah,
AI, which is like
yeah,
taking off and able to recreate things that look incredibly real but aren't. You have a
yeah,
huge war of propaganda. You have right-wing media that has just burrowed itself so deep inside American media. And there's just so many layers. Layer after layer. We're all being squeezed in a late-stage capitalistic dystopian nightmare, right? Our healthcare
Yeah.
is more expensive, eggs are up, and we feel it. We all feel squeezed. I feel squeezed. I feel
Yeah.
like all these systems are designed to extract every penny from my checkbook,
Yeah.
and they will if I let them. I'm always like on
Yeah.
the defense, and I just don't know, even in 10 years from now, where we are as a society, given how much unrest and also how extreme some of these actions by this current regime is that we're seeing. I just don't know
Mm.
what we do with that.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know.
and so I think two things can be true. I think in one sense you are right in that the type of pressures that are being foisted upon us through all those factors that you mentioned is unprecedented. Access to information and having a global population skewed in these different ways, driven by algorithms that have all sorts of ends, including economic.
Right.
The algorithm doesn't have a plan for you to give you a hope and a future and to prosper you,
Right.
right?
Right.
So that is new. But I think the other things that are not new are just the different moments where stability is completely gone, right? And the kinds of things that, like the list of concerns that are before you, are very basic things like food, shelter, family security, right?
Right.
Like those kind of moments are experienced around the world all the time. And in different ways and different degrees throughout history. And I guess I mean you might think, well, what, like, does what I think to be true about God and reconciliation through Jesus Christ have anything to say about this moment? Does it like have anything of relevance or use to how a person can just make their way in the world? Right. I mean, that to me is kind of the fundamental, like that's where whatever kind of language or what you think the gospel is. That's kind of where it hits the road, and then Christianity begins to look very simple. It begins to, like, you start to lose a lot of the other kind of theological culture war kind of stuff, and just really kind of ask yourself, what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to show love and to God and neighbor, right? And then just let that be the filter through which you kind of manage things. And that's I think, I'm no expert, but I think there are moments of kind of clarity that kind of come when you are just overwhelmed by these pressures. But
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, it's I'm kind of in this process of like trying to reconstruct some kind of faith paradigm that I find compelling and like that can help me make
yeah,
sense and meaning of like what's going on. And I think
yeah,
it's tough, like when all you knew was fundamentalism for so long, and like
yeah,
deconstruction kind of wiped the slate clean, which is great. And now you're like, okay, what do I kind of rebuild, but also hold a little bit more loosely than I did last time. And I
yeah,
do think that there's something about mysticism and like just mystery that I just find compelling in this day and age,
yeah,
and I think that in an age of everything being new, I'm kind of burnt out on new, and I want old and
yeah,
ancient, especially when it comes to my
yeah,
spirituality, because
yeah,
I know if it's old and ancient, I know it's rooted somewhere, right? And that means that like it's survived other major tectonic cultural shifts before, and it could
yeah,
probably survive this one as well and kind of ground me into something bigger than myself, but without all of the nationalism and the fundamentalism and like the screw your immigrant neighbors because that's toxic
yeah.
empathy.
Do you think? I mean, do you think that there are clear, like, so? Everyone has a different kind of psychological kind of thermostat, but I tend to be wired towards a little bit more optimism, which is getting it's getting under pressure, but I still kind of feel like there are moments of there's still good in the world, right? And I wonder if one way forward is to shine light on those as well, and to try and is there common ground in that, right? Can people you know, can a starting point for a better way forward be,
Hmm.
highlighting mutually agreed upon examples of good humans doing good things, or complicated
Right.
humans doing things, right? And
Right.
just to kind of remind ourselves about better ways forward. But I guess it's just so hard, like with just the way people's lives are being impacted and torn apart in these forceful ways. It's just how do you take time to say, hey, this person, what's the most important thing to do right now, when seven different areas seem to be the ones that are the most important right now.
Right. I mean, I have real friends that that are queer that made a will when Trump got elected because they were so scared.
Yeah,
And they're like in their
yeah,
30s. I have friends of mine who I have a story of a friend who their child asked them, "Mommy, will you be deported? Like, will ICE come after
yeah,
you because you have darker
yeah,
skin?" Like, this is really
yeah.
impacting people, and it's. I think that's what's so tough is like I don't know what the common ground is except for saving a baby from like a burning building. Like we all agree that's a good thing, But like
Hmm.
when it comes to just like typical things that I would think would
Hmm.
be good, like letting people get married, or like
Yeah.
protecting women and children from being deported who have been here for so long.
Hmm.
It just seems like those are like no, we can't. I mean, I think one example is I'm sure you know the story of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
This was when I knew that it was never about getting criminals out of the country because
Hmm.
Kilmar had a court order not to be deported back to Ecuador.
Yeah,
Kilmar was, I mean, even all of his quote unquote suspicions were really like not super strong about. I
yeah.
think the accusation was he was part of the MS-13 gang.
Right.
None of that was the case. The government admitted that it was a clerical error that got him arrested
Yeah,
and deported. Right, so they even admit that he wasn't even on their list, but it was an
yeah,
accident. They ripped him apart from his wife and his autistic child and his other two children, and then Trump says on the air, "We can't do anything about it. Like we're the world's most powerful
yeah,
government, but we just can't get this
yeah.
guy back."
We
And
have no
people,
jurisdiction.
right, and like people who are on the other side of the aisle are like, well, I guess it is what it is. That sucks. And I'm like, guys, we all agree though that like if this is an error by the big bad government, I know how much you guys hate big government. If the big bad
Right.
government made a clerical error and ripped a family apart, which would violate your pro-family values that you claim to live by, certainly we could agree that at least in this instance, this person should be returned to the country and reunited with his family. Right? But no,
Hmm.
no. No, they don't. And so it's like that's where I continually am at a loss of like it seems like any kind of it seems like most acts of human decency or egregious actions that harm people, we can't agree are either good or egregious because it depends on like who's in office, right? And I don't know what to do with that when it comes to, in particular, my MAGA neighbor. There are definitely some people who I've seen who are like, hey, you know what? I regret voting the way I did. This is not what I signed up
Yeah,
for. Cool. I welcome
yeah,
that. That's great. But like your real hardcore Christian nationalists, Trump is
right,
being used by God to make America great again. My question is how, when, where? Was it
right.
the Nazi salutes that Elon Musk was giving? Was it Doge, which didn't save us any money? Was it defunding USAID, which took literal food out of starving children's mouths overseas? Like which
Yeah.
part of this good thing are you trying to celebrate? Because I can't find it. And I think that for me is where I really feel in the weeds on this because I want to find common ground. This might surprise you, Myron, but like I'm a very
Mhm.
work together, pragmatic person. I will
Mhm.
compromise. Like I will try
Yeah.
to work with someone to find the better path forward. I don't know how to do it with people who think that Kilmar Abrego Garcia deserved to be deported and is now facing, I would argue, bullcrap charges of human
Yeah.
trafficking and like no, and they're not saying anything about it. I'm like, look, if we can't agree on this, we are at a massive. There's a massive catechism or a massive schism,
Yeah.
that separates us. I don't know how to bridge it because this seems just like 101, love your neighbor as yourself. But to them, it's like, no, we're saving America. I just don't get it.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge too is that the moderate voices in the Republican Party have left, right?
Totally.
And the or just remain silent. And so, you know, you kind of wonder what would it take to have the sense that that there needs to be a shared space and a shared discourse, and at
Yeah.
the end, like that's gotta that's most effective when you can get people from the inside saying, this is what needs to happen. This is the way forward.
It just seems like there is no bottom in sight. I mean, I feel just as shocked as I did in 2016 when Trump made the comments about grabbing women, and my tradition my tradition either defended it or poo-pooed it as no big deal. I was genuinely, as a conservative evangelical, I was genuinely shell-shocked then. And it just seems like every day I continue to have that same feeling of deja vu, where it's like, wait, and this, and this, and I mean, dude, we had, I don't mean to rant at you, Myron, but like while we're on the topic, we had a literal insurrection a couple years ago with Christian flags and Bibles and worship songs that motivated all of that, right? And like, most
what you didn't have is the National Guard.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. You didn't have the National Guard. By the way, Trump pardoned all of them. The people who beat police officers with like sticks, they're all pardoned. And somehow that's just tolerated by friends of mine or people that I know who voted for Trump again. I'm like, how do you tolerate that? And then you really think that what's happening in LA as of this recording is law and order? Like the guy who wouldn't call the National Guard in to defend the Capitol building from being taken over, the guy who pardoned all of those insurrectionists suddenly is tough on crime because people were, by the way, peacefully protesting until they sent in the National Guard, right? Like, are you kidding me? And people buy this? That's what I don't understand. And I continue to be baffled at. Continue. It's tough.
Yeah, but it's identity is a powerful thing. And once, we are so disposed to in-group out-group boundaries, right? And once if you have a sense that your own flourishing and future is tied to a particular kind of group identity, that does a lot for the person psychologically. It gives them, it hits a lot. It replaces or acts as a religion in its own way, because it hits all the big existential questions. It gives me a meaning. It gives me a purpose. It gives me a sense of coherent worldview, right? It fits a lot of those things, and it's really going to be hard to dislodge, right? I think it's hard to have confidence in the long game, right? But where will leadership come? And I think what you see globally too is a global realignment of America's place in the world. I mean, we feel that very strongly here in Canada, as Trump's reelection, dramatically reshaped Canadian politics in terms of who we have leading our government now, because there is a strong sense that, wow, we need to protect ourselves against America, right? And it'll be interesting to see, what other voices for democracy, for shared kind of cultural institutions that protect democracy, including education, science, universities. How will that kind of emerge in the geopolitical climate, and where will people find like minds and kindred spirits in that way?
I'm with you. Well, I mean, we'll have to keep the conversation going as we unpack the next couple of years. But, Myron, I appreciate you making time and coming on. If folks want to follow your work or see what you do online, is there a public presence that you have that folks can find?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, website myronapenner.com, and that gets updated fairly regularly in terms of kind of research projects I'm on, and different things that I'm involved in. So happy to put that out there.
Sounds great. Always great talking to you. Let's keep in touch, and we'll have you back on soon.
I appreciate that, Tim. Take care.